In my last video, I introduced you to the four major regions of the brain. For the next few videos, we will take a little time to look at the functions specific to each. As you can guess, this is a meaty chapter, and well, it's essential to understand the parts of the brain if you want to better understand how it controls the rest of the body. In this video, and part of the next one, I'll spend a fair amount of time talking about the cerebrum. So, buckle up everybody! Your objectives for this video are to describe the general organization of the cerebrum and to name and explain the functions of the cerebrum's 5 lobes. You'll also need to be able to describe the main types of cortices of the cerebrum. If we look at the surface of the cerebral hemispheres, we'll find that number one, they look kind of a pinkish gray, but they're highly wrinkled. And this wrinkling helps to pack more neurons into the small space that the brain has to fit into in the cranial cavity. The most superficial layer of the brain is composed of lots of cell bodies and unmyelinated neurons. Together, they make up gray matter. This part of the brain, this superficial layer of the brain, is kind of recently developed, and it's called the neocortex. It has a huge surface area, and there are lots of functions that have been assigned to it. Now let's talk again about that wrinkly surface. The wrinkles, believe it or not, have a name. The grooves that make the wrinkles, like this one, are called sulci. Sulci. So one is called a sulcus. And then the bump that's adjacent is called a gyrus. The plural is gyri. And again, the whole function of these wrinkles is to get more neurons into a small space. So if you take a sheet of paper out from your notebook and you hold it out flat, you see how much space that takes up? Now crumple the notebook paper in your hand and look at how small all of that surface area becomes. That's what the wrinkles do for the brain. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, and it consists of neurons, but all of the neurons are interneurons. They're interneurons, so that means that they stay within the central nervous system, and their primary job is communication. They are not receiving stimuli like the sensory neurons, and they're not causing movements directly like the motor neurons. These just shuttle signals. The cerebrum is made up of 3 kind of layers. Superficially, you have the cerebral cortex, and as you can see here, it's made up of gray matter. So in this image, it doesn't look exactly gray, it looks more brownish, but when you actually look at a cadaver, sometimes it looks more gray, which is why it gets the name gray matter. Deep to that, there's a network of white matter. And remember, white matter consists of myelinated axons. So these particular neurons that make up the white matter are really important for communication over longer distance. And then if we go still deeper into the brain, we'll find that there are little islands of gray matter. These are called the basal nuclei. And these are big centers for signal integration. So the cerebrum is the most superior portion of the brain. I'm just highlighting it here. And it's divided into 2 hemispheres that are separated by this deep groove here. This is called the longitudinal fissure. So you have the left hemisphere of the brain and you have a right hemisphere of the brain. And they control contralateral sides of the body. That means they control the opposite side of the body. So the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. Cool, huh? Now, it's not that these hemispheres, they are separated, but they're not totally isolated from each other. There's a bit of white matter that connects the left and right hemispheres. It's called the corpus callosum. It's highlighted in red here. If we look at this these images of the brain that have been taken from cadavers, we can see the corpus callosum here. To me, it reminds me of like the Starship Enterprise. If you're a Trekkie, you know that this looks a little bit like the disc region. Here we go. So that's the corpus callosum. This is a sagittal view. Here's a frontal view. So it's this area right here. This image is an image of the connectome. It's basically showing the white matter connections between the two hemispheres. So you can see that there's lots of white matter and lots of connections made by the white matter throughout the two hemispheres, and they are connected by nerve fibers that run through the corpus callosum. The cerebrum is separated from the cerebellum, or the little brain, by another fissure. This is called the transverse cerebral fissure. The hemispheres of the brain are not exactly equal. Each hemisphere has specializations, that is, specific functions that are located predominantly in only one half of the brain. About 70 to 95% of people have speech areas, for example, in the left hemisphere of the brain, because about 70 to 95% of people are right-handed. For people who are left-handed, speech areas are often in the right side of the brain. The cerebral hemisphere is divided into 5 different lobes. You have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the insula. Let's take a look at each of them and their functions. The frontal lobes are the most anterior lobes. So in this picture on the left side of your screen, it's the part that's in yellow here, or gold. This is the part of the brain that sits just behind the frontal bone. Its posterior border is the central sulcus, which goes through right here, separating the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And the functions of the frontal lobe include planning and executing movement. You have complex mental functions like behavior, conscience, personality, things like that. There's language there as well. The parietal lobes are just posterior to the frontal lobes. They're the ones in pink here. And they're just posterior to the central sulcus. They include an area called the postcentral gyrus. The main function of the parietal lobes is to process and integrate sensory information, to help form perception and recognize the spatial relationships between objects. And it also helps you pay attention. So if you've started dozing off while listening to my voice, you might need to stimulate your parietal lobe. The next lobe is the temporal lobe, and the function here is kind of easy to remember because this is right near the ear. The temporal lobe has some functions in hearing and the sensation of hearing and perception of hearing. There's some function associated with our ability to comprehend language, particularly here in Wernicke's area. There's some functions here also associated with memory. So people with damage to their temporal lobe may have problems with long-term or short-term memory. A really unusual type of memory that's stored in this lobe is your ability to recognize faces. So people who have damage here in a specific area in the temporal lobe may not be able to recognize the faces of people who are even very close to them. I have a video that talks about someone who has this kind of problem, so I will link that for you in the upper right hand corner of your slide. So now we're at the occipital lobe. Any idea where that might be? Right, it sits just under the occipital bone, right here, the posterior border of the brain. This area of the brain is highly involved in vision. So defects that happen here, or lesions, tumors, infections that might damage this area of the brain, can lead to cortical blindness. So what this means is someone can see something, but they can't see it in their brain. So their eyes work perfectly, but they're blind in their brain. Their brain has lost the ability to detect what's being seen. An example of this I did see where there was a young lady who had an influenza infection, and her fever got so high that this area of the brain wound up being damaged, and so she was basically blinded by influenza because it damaged her brain, the temperatures and everything. In any case, so cortical blindness, sometimes people have difficulty identifying colors or locating objects. Also associated with this area, they may have a problem in being able to recognize words, faces, or objects. The last lobe of the brain is called the insula, and it's here in red. So let me try highlighting this in yellow. It's this red area here. Notice that it's deep in the brain. It's below the lateral fissures, and it is involved in functions related to taste and sensing in your visceral organs. You know, things like your stomach, liver, intestines. When I started this video, I explained that the cerebrum was made up of three main regions, one of which was the cerebral cortex. Remember, that was the most superficial gray region here. I think that arrow's in the wrong spot. Let me redraw that. It's the kind of brownish pink looking layer right here. It's the most superficial layer. All right. So in this layer of gray matter that covers the brain superficially, there's a lot of information processing that happens and functions that happen. Okay. Some of those functions that we talked about being in the 5 cerebral lobes also happens in the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is involved in conscious processing, or conscious processes rather, things that you actively think about and perceive. For example, if I'm in traffic and I'm in a traffic jam, the occipital lobe is going to be actively processing the visual information to see the cars. The parietal lobes are busy helping me pay attention to what's going on and to recognize that I'm seeing lots of cars and what type and how far they are from me. My temporal lobe might help me perceive the music from my radio or the revving of an engine that's behind me in my blind spot. My frontal lobe is busy managing my impatience and trying to help me not get upset. Basically, all of these different lobes are performing a function, and most of that function is happening in the cerebral cortex. Before we leave this video, you need to know that there are specific areas within the cerebral cortex that control particular conscious functions, meaning these areas have groups of neurons that are involved in a specific task. The first area is the primary motor cortex. It's located in the precentral gyrus right here, just in front or just anterior to the central sulcus. Okay, so when you get up from your computer in a few minutes or in a few hours, neurons in this strip of the cerebral cortex will become active and initiate that activity. You have a number of primary somatosensory cortices as well. One of them is located here in the postcentral gyrus, just behind the central sulcus. This is an area that provides conscious awareness of sensation. So there are neurons in your skin that are sending messages in a relay kind of system to this area of your brain so that you can feel the pressure of the pen or pencil or phone that you might have in your hand. Another primary sensory cortex is located here posteriorly in the occipital lobe. This is the primary visual cortex, and it receives visual information from your eyes via your optic nerve, and this allows you to see your computer screen or your phone, or however you're watching this video. You also have a primary auditory cortex, and this is in the temporal lobe right here. And it's receiving audio information from your auditory nerves in your ear, and it's processing it so that you can hear and perceive this lecture. Now, in addition to the primary cortices, there are other parts of the brain called association areas. These areas integrate other information. They are highlighted in orange in this figure over here on the right. In the next video, we'll talk about some of these areas in more detail. But for now, I hope you understand a little bit more about the organization of the brain. Let's do a quick review. In this video, we talked primarily about the cerebrum. Remember, the cerebrum is the most superior portion of the central nervous system. And there are two hemispheres, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. The cerebrum is made up of 3 layers. Externally, we have an expansive layer called the cerebral cortex, and it's made up of gray matter. Remember, the main function of gray matter is integration. So this is a major integration center for the brain. You can think of the cerebral cortex as being kind of like this piece of paper. If we were to stretch it out, it would take up a lot of space. Fortunately, though, it's not spread out like that, but rather it's folded. I didn't do a great job of folding this. So let's try that again. It's folded, kind of like this. So what this does is it allows us to cram more neurons into a small space, the small space that is called the cranial cavity inside of the skull. Now, when we look at the surface of the cerebral cortex, remember the ridges like this, they would be called gyri, and the grooves like this, that would be between the gyri, they're called sulci. Okay. So in the lecture you heard me talk, or you may hear me talk about something called the central sulcus, then you know that that's going to be a groove on the surface of the brain. If you hear me talk about like the precentral gyrus or the postcentral gyrus, then you know we're talking about the ridge. So that's why it's important to know that. Now, we said that the cerebrum is divided into 2 halves, but the 2 halves are not functionally the same. Remember, we talked about something called brain lateralization, which means that certain functions that are related to speech, for example, are located in only one hemisphere. And other functions related to, say, control or our ability to pay attention to what's going on around us may be seated in a different hemisphere. So remember lateralization. The other thing you might want to remember is that the right hemisphere of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain, the left hemisphere rather, controls the right side of the body. We call this contralateral. Okay, so there's contralateral control of motor function at the body. And this happens primarily because there are neurons that are housed on one side of the brain. They travel through the brain and then they cross over to the other side of the body, either at the brain stem or in the spinal cord. So we get that contralateral control. The crossing over is called decussation, but we'll talk about that in the next video. We said that the cerebral hemispheres were divided into 5 lobes. The first lobe was called the frontal lobe, and remember it sits right here behind the forehead. Your frontal lobe is responsible for a lot of your higher mental functions. So it's responsible for our behavior and personality. It's what helps us imagine that vacation we're looking forward to in a few months or in a year. It's what helps us to plan our activities and our movements. It also helps us control our emotions. Posterior to the frontal lobe, we have the parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe has a few different functions. One of its most important functions is that it integrates sensory information. So when you see something, or when you feel like a fly or someone touch your skin or your body, that information is processed in the parietal lobe. It's the parietal lobe that helps you understand what the sensation means and helps you to kind of associate that sensation with something that you've seen or experienced before. This is why, for example, sometimes when people have damage to their parietal lobe, they may lose the ability to recognize the faces of people that they love. They can see the faces, but they may not recognize them because there's damage in the parietal lobe. Posterior to the parietal lobe, we have the occipital lobe, which processes visual information. You might have had this happen if you hit the back of your head really hard on the floor or on a wall. You see stars briefly. That's because that impact went to your occipital lobe. We also mentioned the temporal lobes, which are located laterally. Your temporal lobes have a lot of function that are related to your memory and emotion. They also have functions related to your ability to hear. Then deep to the parietal lobes, you have a fifth lobe called the insula. And the insula is responsible for your ability to taste, as well as your ability to detect certain visceral sensations. So those are your 5 lobes, and you'll need to know those for your exam. We also said that there were 3 main types of cortices in the brain. We called them the primary motor cortex, which is responsible for voluntary movement. We talked about the primary somatosensory cortex, which is responsible for us being able to detect changes in our environment. It's related to our ability to detect and sense sensory information. And we said that there were association areas. These are areas that can interpret one type of information or multiple types of information, and then help our brain process what that information means. So that's what we talked about in this video. In the next video, we're going to talk solely about the motor cortex and some of the functions that it gives to our body. And it's a really interesting video, so I look forward to seeing you there. As always, if you have any questions about this video or any of my videos, don't hesitate to email or text with your question. I'm more than happy to hear from you and answer any questions that you might have. So I'll see you at the next video. Until then, take care.